The beginning of Abigail's journey. In the sleepy town of Silverbrook, nestled between rolling hills and serene forests, life moved at a slow and predictable pace. The town's residents prided themselves on tradition, deeply rooted values, and a sense of belonging that had spanned generations. Everyone knew everyone else's business, and in a place like Silverbrook, where change was a stranger, differences were often met with suspicion. It was a town where appearances mattered more than anything else, and stepping out of line often meant becoming the subject of gossip. Abigail Walker, a woman in her mid-30s, had always lived in Silverbrook. She had inherited her family's large, stately home at the edge of town when her parents passed away. She was well liked for her warm smile and her kind, gentle demeanor. But despite her outward charm, Abigail had always felt a deep sense of loneliness. Years had passed since she had lost her parents, and while she had friends in Silverbrook, there was a void in her life that nothing seemed to fill. She longed for a family of her own, but had never found the right partner. Abigail's life changed on a brisk autumn day, when she made a decision that would set her on a path she could never have imagined. She was volunteering at a local orphanage in the nearby city of Middleton, where she spent her weekends reading to the children and helping with their activities. It was there that she first laid eyes on a tiny boy with wide brown eyes and a quiet, soulful gaze. He sat alone in a corner of the playroom, clutching a worn-out stuffed bear, his small hands trembling as if the world around him was too large and too unkind. The boy's name was Lucas, and at just 2 years old, he had already seen more hardship than most people do in a lifetime. He had been born to a teenage mother who couldn't care for him, and had been left at the orphanage shortly after birth. Unlike the other children, who were boisterous and eager for attention, Lucas remained quiet, almost withdrawn, as if he had learned not to expect kindness from the world. His skin was dark, contrasting starkly with the other children at the orphanage, and it was clear that this made him stand out in ways that even a child could feel. Abigail felt a tug at her heart the moment she saw Lucas. There was something in his eyes that mirrored her own loneliness, a longing for love and belonging that she knew all too well. Without hesitation, she walked over to him, knelt down, and offered him a soft smile. "Hello there," she said gently. "What's your bear's name?" Lucas looked up at her, his wide eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and fear. He didn't answer right away, but Abigail waited patiently. After a few moments, he whispered, "Teddy." "Teddy's a good name," Abigail said, her voice warm and inviting. "He looks like a good friend." Lucas nodded, still clutching the bear tightly to his chest. From that moment on, Abigail couldn't get Lucas out of her mind. She visited the orphanage more frequently, spending time with him, reading him stories, and watching as he slowly began to open up. The other children would run and play, but Lucas preferred the quiet moments with Abigail. In her presence, he seemed to feel safe. Weeks passed, and with each visit, Abigail's bond with Lucas grew stronger. She began to consider the impossible. Could she adopt him? The idea seemed absurd at first. Abigail, a single woman, adopting a child, especially a child of a different race, was something the town of Silverbrook would never accept. But the more she thought about it, the more certain she became. She didn't care about what the town thought. Lucas needed her, and she needed him. One cold December afternoon, Abigail sat in the office of the orphanage's director, a stern woman named Mrs. Halloway. She explained her desire to adopt Lucas, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. She knew the challenges she would face, but her heart was set on giving this little boy a home. Mrs. Halloway raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback by Abigail's request. "Miss Walker, are you sure you understand what you're asking for? Adopting a child is a big responsibility, especially a child like Lucas. He's different." Abigail's jaw tightened. She knew what Mrs. Halloway meant, but she refused to let the woman's words discourage her. "Lucas deserves a family just like any other child," Abigail said firmly. "I can give him that." Mrs. Halloway studied Abigail for a moment, then sighed. It's not just about you, Miss Walker. This town, well, you know how people are. They'll talk. They'll judge. You and Lucas will face challenges, some you may not be prepared for." Abigail's heart pounded in her chest. She had thought about this, of course. She knew that adopting a black child in a predominantly white town would stir up gossip and judgment. But none of that mattered. What mattered was Lucas and giving him the love and security he needed. "I don't care what people say," Abigail said softly but with resolve. "Lucas is worth it." The adoption process was long and grueling, but Abigail persisted. She faced questions, raised eyebrows, and even discouraging comments from some of her closest friends, but her resolve never wavered. By the time spring arrived, Lucas was legally her son. The day she brought him home was both joyful and filled with trepidation. Abigail drove through the familiar streets of Silverbrook, her hands gripping the steering wheel as Lucas sat in the back seat, gazing out of the window at the town that would soon become his home. The road was lined with quaint houses, each with manicured lawns and white picket fences. Abigail knew what lay ahead, curious eyes watching, gossiping tongues ready to spread rumors. But none of that mattered now. All that mattered was the little boy sitting in the back seat, his innocent gaze taking in a world that had been cruel to him from the start. When Abigail and Lucas arrived home, she carried him inside and showed him his new room. She had spent weeks preparing it, filling it with toys, books, and soft, colorful bedding. Lucas looked around, his eyes wide with wonder, but there was a lingering uncertainty in his expression. He had never known stability, and Abigail knew it would take time for him to feel safe and secure. That night, as Abigail tucked Lucas into bed for the first time, she sat beside him, her heart swelling with love and a fierce protective instinct. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. She knew the town would talk, and Lucas would face challenges because of his skin color. But as she looked into his big brown eyes, she made a silent promise. She would protect him from the cruelty of the world. She would give him the love and life he deserved, no matter what anyone else thought. "You're my son now, Lucas," she whispered as she brushed a stray curl from his forehead. "And I will always love you, no matter what." As Lucas drifted off to sleep, Abigail sat in the quiet of his room, watching him breathe peacefully. She had no way of knowing then how much her decision would change not just her life, but the lives of those around her. The town of Silverbrook wasn't ready for the change that was about to come, but Abigail was. She would face whatever came her way with strength and love, for Lucas and for herself. And so, with Lucas tucked safely in his new bed, Abigail braced herself for the storm that was sure to come. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would test her in ways she had never imagined, and in the end, it would be Lucas who would change the town forever. The silent struggle. The first few months after Lucas moved into Abigail's home were a mixture of tender moments and silent battles. The small house at the edge of Silverbrook, with its creaking floors and ivy-covered walls, had become a haven for them both. Inside, the warmth of their new life together bloomed like the flowers in Abigail's garden, each day bringing new routines, laughter, and a bond that deepened with every shared meal, every bedtime story. But outside their little sanctuary, the world was far less kind. Silverbrook, like many small towns, was a place where change came slowly, if at all. It was a town where everyone attended the same church on Sundays, waved at each other from their front porches, and gathered at the local diner for breakfast gossip. When Abigail appeared with Lucas at her side, a black child among the sea of familiar faces, the town's collective gaze turned cold. The whispers started before she could even step foot inside the local grocery store, where she had shopped for years without so much as a second glance. Now her every move seemed to be scrutinized, her every choice questioned by those who once called her a friend. At first, it was the subtle things. Neighbors who had always stopped to chat with Abigail now seemed to cross the street when they saw her coming. Invitations to afternoon teas and church socials, once abundant, had all but disappeared. But what hurt the most was the way people treated Lucas. When she took him to the park, mothers gathered in tight-knit groups, their eyes flickering toward him with thinly veiled disdain. Their children, once eager to play with anyone who showed up, were now kept at a distance, as though Lucas's very presence was somehow a threat. It wasn't long before Lucas, too young to fully understand but old enough to notice, began to feel the weight of the town's rejection. He had been quiet in the orphanage, but now his silence deepened, turning into something more profound, more unsettling. Abigail watched him as he sat in the corner of the living room, his small fingers tracing patterns on the arm of the couch, his eyes downcast. "Lucas," Abigail called softly one evening as she prepared dinner. She had been making his favorite, a warm chicken stew, but Lucas had barely touched his bowl. Instead, he sat at the table, his tiny hands wrapped around his spoon, staring blankly into the steam rising from his meal. He looked up at her, his big brown eyes filled with questions he didn't know how to ask. "Why do people look at me like that?" Abigail's heart broke a little more with each passing day as she watched the world chip away at Lucas's innocence. She knelt beside him, reaching out to smooth his unruly curls. How could she explain something so cruel to someone so young? "Some people, they don't understand things that are different," she began, choosing her words carefully. "They're afraid of what they don't know. But that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. Lucas, you are perfect, just the way you are." Lucas stared at her for a moment, then looked down at his bowl again. He didn't say anything, but Abigail could see the hurt in his eyes. She wanted to wrap him in a blanket of love so thick that the world's cruelty would never touch him, but she knew that wasn't possible. What she could do, though, was be there for him, every day, in every way. She would never let him face this world alone. Abigail thought the worst of the town's judgment had come in the early days of Lucas's adoption, but she quickly learned that prejudice had layers, and with each new situation, a fresh layer was exposed. One afternoon, just before the school year began, Abigail decided to take Lucas into town to buy him new clothes and supplies. She had always shopped at Granger's, the only general store in Silverbrook, where the elderly Mr. and Mrs. Granger had known her since she was a child. As they entered the store, the familiar sound of the bell jingling above the door, Abigail's stomach twisted with unease. Mrs. Granger was at the counter, as she always was, but when she saw Lucas, her smile faltered. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but Abigail noticed. She noticed, too, how the older woman's gaze lingered on Lucas's dark skin, her eyes hardening just a fraction. Abigail brushed it off at first, determined to keep the experience positive for Lucas. He deserved to be treated like any other child. They walked through the store, picking out notebooks, pencils, and crayons. Lucas was fascinated by the brightly colored items, his little face lighting up in a way that reminded Abigail of just how much joy children could find in simple things. But as they moved through the aisles, the weight of Mrs. Granger's stare pressed down on Abigail. It felt as though she were being judged for every item she picked up, for every smile she gave her son. When they reached the counter, Mrs. Granger greeted Abigail with her usual politeness, but her tone was cool, her smile stiff. She rang up their purchases in silence, her eyes darting between Abigail and Lucas as though she were trying to make sense of something that defied her understanding. As Abigail handed over the money, Mrs. Granger hesitated. "You know, Abigail," she began, her voice low, almost conspiratorial, "this town, it's not the kind of place where things like this are accepted." Abigail's chest tightened. She knew what Mrs. Granger meant. She knew that by things like this, the older woman was referring to her choice to adopt Lucas, to raise a black child in a town that clung so tightly to its outdated values. But she also knew that if she allowed these comments to go unchecked, Lucas would one day feel their sting even more acutely than he already did. "I didn't ask for the town's acceptance," Abigail replied, her voice steady. "I'm just raising my son." Mrs. Granger's expression faltered for a moment, as though she hadn't expected Abigail to push back. But before she could say anything more, Abigail gathered the bags and took Lucas's hand, walking out of the store with her head held high. As they stepped back onto the street, she squeezed Lucas's hand a little tighter, hoping to convey through that small gesture just how much she loved him, how much she believed in him. That night, as Lucas played with his new school supplies at the kitchen table, Abigail sat nearby, watching him with a heavy heart. She knew the challenges he would face once school started. Silverbrook Elementary wasn't a particularly diverse place, and she had already heard whispers from other parents about how they felt concerned about Lucas joining their children in the classroom. It was a small town, and news, especially the kind that fueled gossip, spread quickly. The first day of school came faster than Abigail had expected. She had prepared Lucas as best as she could, talking to him about what to expect and reassuring him that he was loved, no matter what anyone else said. But when she dropped him off at the front gate, her heart ached with the knowledge that once he stepped inside, she wouldn't be there to shield him from the world's cruelty. The schoolyard was filled with children, some of whom Abigail recognized from her own childhood. Their parents had been her classmates, and now their children would be Lucas. But the looks on their faces as they stared at Lucas, confusion, curiosity, and in some cases, disdain, told her that this was not going to be easy. She watched as Lucas hesitated at the gate, clutching his new backpack tightly to his chest, before walking slowly toward the school building. That evening, when Abigail picked him up, Lucas was unusually quiet. He didn't offer any details about his day, and when Abigail asked him how school went, he simply shrugged. But she saw the mud on his shoes and the way his shoulders slumped, and she knew he had already faced the cruel realities of the world outside their home. It wasn't until later that night, as Abigail was tucking him into bed, that Lucas finally spoke. "Mom," he whispered, his voice small and shaky, "why do the kids at school say I don't belong?" Abigail's heart clenched. She sat down on the edge of his bed, brushing his curls away from his forehead. "Lucas, sometimes people are mean because they don't understand something. They don't know how special you are." "But they said I'm different," he murmured, his eyes filling with tears. "You are different," Abigail said softly, her voice filled with love. "And that's what makes you amazing. You're smart and kind, and you have the biggest heart. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you don't belong, because you do. You belong with me." As Lucas drifted off to sleep, Abigail stayed by his side, her mind racing. She had known this would be hard, but she hadn't expected it to cut so deeply, so quickly. She thought of all the battles Lucas would have to fight in the years to come, battles she couldn't always protect him from. But she made a vow that night as she sat in the dim light of his room. No matter how hard it got, no matter how many people judged them, she would never let Lucas feel like he was alone in this world. The silent struggle between love and prejudice was far from over, but Abigail knew one thing for sure. She would never stop fighting for her son, and she would never stop teaching him to rise above the cruelty of others, no matter how painful it might be. The burden of belonging. As Lucas grew older, the small world of Silverbrook began to feel smaller, more claustrophobic. By the time he entered middle school, the isolation he had once been too young to fully comprehend now loomed over him like a shadow. Every day was a test of endurance, a struggle to navigate a space where he was continually reminded of his difference, his otherness. Silverbrook Middle School was no different from the town itself, an insular place, steeped in tradition, resistant to change. Abigail had hoped that as Lucas matured, people's minds would begin to shift, that maybe the kindness she had tried to instill in him would somehow soften the hearts of those around them. But it seemed the town's prejudices ran deeper than she had imagined, stretching through generations like invisible chains that held people back from progress. At 12, Lucas was no longer the shy, quiet child who had clung to Abigail's side in those early days. He had grown into a thoughtful, introspective boy with a sharp intellect and an insatiable curiosity. He loved science, devouring every book on biology, chemistry, and physics that he could get his hands on. He spent hours in his room, conducting small experiments with whatever materials he could find around the house. His dream of becoming a doctor had not faded, but rather had grown more vivid, more urgent, as he imagined a future where he could use his knowledge to help others. But even as Lucas's academic brilliance became impossible for his teachers to ignore, it did little to shield him from the cruelty of his peers. The children of Silverbrook had inherited their parents' biases, their small-mindedness passed down like an unwanted heirloom. In the classroom, Lucas's intelligence earned him praise, but outside, it made him a target. He was too smart, too different, and for the other kids, it was easier to push him away than to try to understand him. One chilly autumn afternoon, as Lucas made his way to the school bus, a group of boys from his class blocked his path. Tommy was among them, the same boy who had pushed him down years earlier. He had grown taller, more muscular, and meaner. "Hey, Lucas," Tommy sneered, stepping closer. "You think you're better than us or something." Lucas kept his head down, gripping the straps of his backpack tightly. He had learned long ago that responding only made things worse. "Answer me," Tommy demanded, shoving Lucas hard enough to knock him off balance. The other boys snickered, circling him like vultures waiting to pick apart their prey. Lucas straightened, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to run, but he also knew that running would only give them more ammunition. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. "Always choose love over hate, even when it's hard." But love felt like a distant concept in the face of this raw, unprovoked hostility. "I'm just trying to get home," Lucas muttered, hoping they would lose interest and let him go. But Tommy wasn't done. "You don't belong here," he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're just a charity case. Your mom only took you in because she felt sorry for you." The words hit Lucas like a punch to the gut. He had heard similar things before, whispered in hallways or muttered under breath, but hearing them from Tommy with such venom was like a wound reopening. "Your mom should have left you where you came from," another boy chimed in, his sneer widening. Lucas's fists clenched at his sides. He could feel the anger bubbling up inside him, threatening to boil over. He knew he was smarter than these boys, that he had a future beyond Silverbrook, but in that moment, all he wanted was to make them feel a fraction of the pain they had inflicted on him for years. "Back off," he muttered through gritted teeth. Tommy laughed, but there was no humor in it, only malice. "Or what? You gonna fight us?" Lucas's mind raced. He had never been in a real fight before, never thrown a punch in his life. Violence was something he had always avoided, something Abigail had taught him to see as a last resort. But as the boys closed in, their laughter ringing in his ears, a deep primal instinct took over. Before he could think, Lucas's fist shot out, connecting with Tommy's jaw. The impact surprised them both, sending Tommy stumbling backward, his hand flying to his face in shock. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The other boys frozen in place, their smirks wiped clean from their faces. But then everything happened at once. Tommy lunged at Lucas, tackling him to the ground. Fists flew, and before Lucas knew it, he was on his back, struggling to fend off Tommy's blows. The other boys stood by, cheering their ringleader on, their voices a blur in Lucas's ears. He could feel the sting of Tommy's punches, but more than that, he felt the weight of the hatred behind them. By the time a teacher pulled them apart, Lucas's lip was split, his eye already swelling. Tommy was hauled away, still shouting threats, while Lucas was left sitting on the ground, dazed and bruised. The crowd that had gathered slowly dispersed, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Later that evening, when Abigail saw the state of his face, she rushed to his side, her eyes wide with concern. "What happened?" she demanded, kneeling in front of him, her hands trembling as she examined his injuries. Lucas couldn't meet her gaze. "It was Tommy," he muttered. They won't leave me alone." Abigail's face darkened. She had known that Lucas was being bullied, but she hadn't realized just how bad it had gotten. "Did you fight back?" she asked, her voice soft but tinged with something Lucas couldn't quite identify. "Disappointment," maybe, or fear. Lucas hesitated, then nodded. I hit him first. Abigail sighed, her shoulders slumping. She pulled Lucas into a hug, holding him tightly. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I'm so sorry you have to go through this. But fighting, it won't fix anything. It'll only make things worse. I didn't know what else to do, Lucas said, his voice small, almost childlike. Abigail pulled back, cupping his face in her hands. I know it's hard, sweetheart, but you're better than this. You have so much ahead of you. And these boys, they're just scared of what they don't understand. They don't see how special you are, but one day they will. One day, you're going to prove them all wrong. Her words were meant to comfort him, but Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how hard he tried, no matter how smart he was or how kind he tried to be, Silverbrook would never accept him. He had spent years trying to belong, but now he wasn't sure he wanted to. The town had made it clear that he would always be an outsider, no matter how much he achieved or how hard he worked to fit in. In the weeks that followed the fight, Lucas threw himself into his schoolwork, using his studies as an escape. He stopped talking about the other kids, stopped mentioning the bullying. He buried it deep inside, focusing instead on his dream of becoming a doctor, of leaving Silverbrook behind for good. He spent hours at the library, poring over medical journals and textbooks, his mind hungry for knowledge. His teachers couldn't help but notice his brilliance, even as they struggled with their own biases. Mrs. Willow, his science teacher, pulled him aside one day after class. Lucas, she began, her tone measured, your understanding of biology is beyond impressive for your age. Have you ever thought about a career in medicine? Lucas's eyes lit up, the dream that had been growing inside him, since he was a child, suddenly feeling more tangible, more real. I want to be a doctor, he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. Mrs. Willow nodded, her expression softening. I think you'd make an excellent doctor. You have the intelligence and the compassion. That's rare. For the first time in what felt like forever, Lucas felt seen, truly seen, not as the black boy in a white town, not as an outsider, but as someone with potential, someone who could make a difference. He carried that feeling with him as he left school that day, a small ember of hope flickering in his chest. But even as his dreams began to take shape, Lucas knew that the road ahead would not be easy. The weight of Silverbrook's judgment still hung heavy over him, a constant reminder that no matter how far he went, the town's prejudice would always be a part of his story. Still, he vowed to push forward, to rise above the cruelty and ignorance that surrounded him. He would prove them wrong, not with fists, not with anger, but with his mind, his heart, and the strength Abigail had instilled in him from the very beginning. And one day, he would leave Silverbrook behind, not as a boy who had been broken by the town's small-mindedness, but as a man who had risen above it, rising above and breaking the chains. As Lucas entered high school, the world around him seemed to stretch out and shrink all at once. On one hand, his academic achievements opened up new possibilities, as teachers and guidance counselors began to take serious notice of his intelligence and ambition. They encouraged him to apply for advanced classes, to seek out college preparatory programs, and to start thinking about his future beyond the walls of Silverbrook. On the other hand, the town itself remained as stifling and judgmental as ever. Every day was a reminder that despite his brilliance, he was still seen as an outsider. By this point, Lucas had grown used to the stares, the whispers, and the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, exclusion. The small cracks in his confidence that had formed in elementary school had become deeper in middle school, but high school was something different. Here, he faced a new kind of pressure, a weight heavier than the taunts and isolation, the burden of proving himself. Silverbrook High was a typical small-town school, but it still had its hierarchies. The football players ruled the social scene, the cheerleaders dictated what was cool, and everyone else fell into a complex web of cliques and social groups. Lucas, unsurprisingly, didn't fit into any of these categories. He was too smart for the average crowd, too quiet for the popular kids, and too different to blend in with anyone else. He stood out, and not in a way that anyone in the town appreciated. For most of the students, high school was about maintaining the status quo. But for Lucas, it became a battleground, a place where he fought, day in and day out, to carve out a space for himself, to prove that he was more than the labels people had placed on him. His academic excellence was no longer just a goal. It became a form of armor, a way to shield himself from the relentless negativity around him. Lucas nodded, but deep down, he wasn't sure if he could keep going like this. The weight of proving himself, to the town, to his classmates, to himself, felt heavier than ever. He knew his mother believed in him, but was that enough? Could he really rise above the constant barrage of negativity and find a place where he belonged? As the months passed, Lucas threw himself even deeper into his studies. His academic performance became his escape, his way of proving, to himself and to others, that he was worth more than the cruel words and stares that followed him through the halls of Silverbrook High. He began to think about college, about leaving the town behind once and for all. But even as his future stretched out before him, bright and full of possibilities, the present remained a constant struggle. Then one day, something unexpected happened. It was a few weeks before the end of his junior year when Lucas received an invitation to participate in a regional science competition. His biology teacher, Mrs. Willow, had recommended him for the competition after noticing his deep passion for the subject. The competition was a big deal, drawing students from all over the state, and it offered a scholarship to the winner, one that could potentially open doors to some of the best universities in the country. For Lucas, the competition represented more than just an academic opportunity. It was a chance to prove, to the town, to his peers, and to himself, that he was capable of greatness. He spent weeks preparing, poring over textbooks and research papers, conducting experiments late into the night. He wanted to win, not just for the scholarship, but for the validation it would bring. On the day of the competition, Abigail drove him to the nearby city where it was being held. As they pulled into the parking lot, Lucas felt a wave of nervousness wash over him. This was his chance to prove himself on a bigger stage, outside the confines of Silverbrook, but the fear of failure loomed large in his mind. "Are you ready?" Abigail asked, turning to him with a reassuring smile. Lucas took a deep breath and nodded. "I think so." Abigail reached over and gave his hand a gentle squeeze. "No matter what happens, I'm proud of you. Remember that." As Lucas entered the competition hall, the scale of the event hit him. The room was filled with students, all of them just as smart and driven as he was. For the first time, he wasn't the smartest person in the room, and that realization both excited and terrified him. The competition was intense, with students being asked to solve complex scientific problems, present their findings, and defend their research in front of a panel of judges. Lucas focused all of his energy on the task at hand, determined to give it his best shot. Hours later, as the competition came to a close, Lucas sat in the audience with Abigail by his side, waiting for the results to be announced. His heart pounded in his chest as the judges took the stage. "And the winner of this year's regional science competition is..." The head judge paused, scanning the room before finally announcing the name. "Lucas Walker." For a moment, Lucas didn't move. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. Abigail let out a gasp, her eyes shining with pride as she hugged him tightly. "You did it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. As Lucas made his way to the stage to accept his award, he felt something shift inside him. For so long, he had been weighed down by the need to prove himself, to rise above the expectations and limitations placed on him by others. But in this moment, standing on that stage, he realized that he didn't need anyone's validation. He had proven it to himself. From that day forward, Lucas approached life with a renewed sense of purpose. He no longer cared about the whispers or the stares. He had bigger dreams, bigger goals, and nothing, Not the town's small-mindedness, not the cruelty of his peers, could stand in his way. Silverbrook may never fully accept him, but Lucas had accepted himself, and that, he realized, was the only acceptance that truly mattered. The unexpected turn. Lucas's life, which had once felt like an endless uphill climb, began to shift after his victory at the regional science competition. Winning that award was more than just a personal triumph. It sent ripples through Silverbrook. Suddenly, the town that had cast him and his mother as outcasts could no longer ignore his brilliance. His name, once whispered in scorn or pity, became synonymous with something Silverbrook rarely saw: success against the odds. Yet, for all the accolades and congratulations that followed, Lucas knew that acceptance wouldn't come overnight. The town wasn't a place that easily forgot its biases, but Lucas was no longer looking for validation from them. He had realized that his worth wasn't tied to what the people in Silverbrook thought of him. He had Abigail's unwavering love and support, a growing sense of self-assurance, and a clear vision for his future. Still, as Lucas approached his senior year of high school, a lingering sense of isolation remained. He had carved out a place for himself academically, but socially, the same barriers that had been there since childhood persisted. He had a handful of acquaintances, mostly other students who shared his passion for science, but none of the deep friendships that many of his classmates enjoyed. He wondered sometimes if this was the price he had to pay for being different, for standing out in a town that valued conformity above all else. As senior year wore on, Lucas became increasingly focused on his future. College applications were looming, and he knew that getting into the right university could change everything. His goal was clear: to become a doctor, just as he had dreamed as a child. But with that goal came pressure. He needed scholarships to afford college, and every grade, every extracurricular activity, every recommendation letter felt like a crucial step in determining his future. Abigail, as always, was his rock. She worked tirelessly to support him, picking up extra shifts at the small diner where she had been working for years. Despite the exhaustion that showed in her eyes at the end of each day, she never wavered in her belief in Lucas. She encouraged him to dream big, to apply to top-tier schools even though they seemed out of reach financially. "Don't limit yourself," she would say, sitting across from him at the kitchen table, her face lit by the soft glow of a single lamp. "You have so much potential, Lucas. You've already proven you can achieve great things." Lucas took her words to heart, sending out applications to prestigious universities across the country. He applied to schools with strong pre-med programs, schools where he knew he could thrive academically. But in the back of his mind, he worried about the cost. Even with scholarships, could they really afford it? Abigail never expressed any doubt, but Lucas knew how hard she worked to keep their modest home running. In the midst of his senior year stress, something unexpected happened. Something that would force Lucas to confront a part of his past he had long tried to ignore. It started with a phone call. Lucas had just come home from school one afternoon, his backpack slung over one shoulder, when he heard the phone ringing. Abigail was still at work, so he rushed to pick it up, expecting it to be one of her friends or maybe a call from a college admissions office. "Hello," he said, slightly out of breath. "Is this Lucas Walker?" a male voice asked. Lucas frowned, unsure who would be calling him directly. "Yes, this is Lucas." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before the voice continued. "My name is Andrew Caldwell. I'm your father." For a moment, Lucas didn't speak. He had never met his biological father, had never even heard the man's name. Abigail had told him bits and pieces over the years, enough to know that his father hadn't been part of his life by choice. Lucas had never pressed for more information, understanding from a young age that his mother's silence on the subject came from a place of hurt. Now, hearing the man's voice on the other end of the phone, Lucas felt a wave of emotions he wasn't prepared for: anger, confusion, and a strange sense of curiosity. "Why are you calling me?" Lucas asked, his voice tense. "I know this is unexpected," Andrew said. his tone sounding uncertain. "I've been thinking about you for a long time, Lucas. I know I haven't been part of your life, and I regret that. But I'd like to meet you, if you're willing." Lucas didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to hang up the phone, to reject the man who had abandoned him and his mother all those years ago. But another part of him, a part he hadn't fully acknowledged before, was curious. Why now? What had changed? "I don't think that's a good idea," Lucas finally said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Please," Andrew said, desperation creeping into his voice. "Just hear me out. I know I don't deserve anything from you, but I need to explain why I wasn't there. There's more to the story than you know." Lucas hesitated. His instinct was to protect himself, to keep this man at arm's length, but something in Andrew's voice, a sincerity, perhaps, made him pause. He had spent his whole life wondering about his father, and now here was the chance to get answers, even if he wasn't sure he wanted them. "Fine," Lucas said, after what felt like an eternity. "We can meet, but don't expect anything from me." Andrew agreed, and they set a time and place to meet later that week. After hanging up, Lucas sat in silence for a long time, the weight of the conversation settling over him like a heavy blanket. When Abigail came home that evening, Lucas told her about the phone call. He expected her to be angry, to tell him not to go through with it. But instead, she surprised him. "I wondered if he might reach out one day," she said softly, sitting beside him at the kitchen table. "I didn't think it would be this soon. But, Lucas, this is your decision. Whatever you choose, I'll support you." Lucas looked at her, searching her face for signs of bitterness or resentment, but all he saw was the same quiet strength she had always shown him. "Why didn't you ever tell me more about him?" Lucas asked. Abigail sighed, folding her hands in her lap. "I didn't want his absence to define you. I didn't want you to feel like you were missing something, because you weren't. You've always had everything you needed right here, with me." Lucas nodded, understanding her reasoning, even though he still had so many questions. The day of the meeting came faster than Lucas expected. He found himself standing outside a small cafe in the next town over, his hands shoved in his pockets as he waited for Andrew to arrive. He felt a knot of anxiety in his stomach, unsure of what to expect. When Andrew finally appeared, Lucas was struck by how different he looked from the image he had always carried in his mind. He was older, of course, with lines etched into his face and a tired look in his eyes. But there was something familiar about him too, a shared resemblance that Lucas couldn't ignore. They sat down at a table, and for a long time, neither of them spoke. It was Andrew who finally broke the silence. "I know I can't make up for the years I missed," he said, his voice low and hesitant, "but I want to try to explain why I wasn't there. I owe you that much." Lucas listened as Andrew told his story, a story of fear, immaturity, and regret. He spoke of how, when Abigail had become pregnant, he had panicked. He wasn't ready to be a father, and instead of stepping up, he had run. He had spent years convincing himself that he wasn't capable of being a father, that Lucas was better off without him. But then, Andrew's life had taken a turn. He had gotten older, had gone through his own struggles, and had come to realize the gravity of what he had missed. He had thought about reaching out many times, but had been too ashamed. It wasn't until recently, when he had heard about Lucas's success in the science competition, that he had finally gathered the courage to make the call. "I know it's too late to be the father you deserved," Andrew said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I want to get to know you, if you'll let me." Lucas sat in silence, absorbing everything. Part of him wanted to forgive Andrew, to let go of the anger he had carried for so long. But another part of him, the part that had grown up without a father, the part that had watched his mother struggle to raise him on her own, wasn't sure if he could. "You can't just show up now and expect me to let you in," Lucas said, his voice calm but firm. "It doesn't work like that." Andrew nodded, clearly expecting the response. "I know. I'm not asking for a second chance right away. I just want to start somewhere." For the rest of the conversation, they talked carefully, like two strangers trying to find common ground. It wasn't easy, and Lucas didn't know where things would go from there. But as he left the cafe that afternoon, he realized something. Meeting Andrew hadn't changed who he was. It hadn't filled some missing piece in his life. Instead, it had only reinforced what he already knew, that the person he had become was the result of his own hard work and Abigail's unwavering love. His father's absence had shaped him, but it didn't define him. And now, with his future looming on the horizon, Lucas was ready to face whatever came next, on his terms, not anyone else's. Rising above, Lucas stood in the center of the living room, his hands clutching the acceptance letters that had arrived in the mail just days before. He had been accepted into several prestigious universities, including two of his top choices, Harvard and Johns Hopkins. Abigail sat across from him, her eyes brimming with pride, though there was a hint of worry behind her smile. This was the moment they had both been waiting for, but it also marked the beginning of a significant change in their lives. "Have you made your decision?" Abigail asked, her voice warm but cautious. She knew how monumental this decision was for Lucas. It would shape the rest of his life. Lucas exhaled deeply, the weight of the choice pressing down on him. Johns Hopkins was known for its renowned medical program, a place where he could thrive as a future doctor. But it was also far from home, in a city that was as foreign to him as the bustling world outside of Silverbrook. Harvard, on the other hand, carried the prestige and legacy of academic excellence, but wasn't quite as specialized in medicine as Hopkins. Both offered scholarships that could ease the financial burden, but the decision felt impossibly heavy. "I think I'm going to choose Johns Hopkins," Lucas finally said, meeting Abigail's eyes. "It feels like the right place for me, like I can really grow there. And I know it's far, but this is my chance." Abigail nodded, though the pang of separation was clear on her face. She had raised him alone, and the idea of him leaving was bittersweet, but she had always known this day would come. She had prepared for it since the day she first held him in her arms. Lucas wasn't just her son. He was a young man with the world at his feet, and she couldn't stand in the way of his future. "That's wonderful, Lucas. I'm so proud of you," she said, standing up and embracing him. "You're going to change the world. I just know it." The next few months were a whirlwind of preparations. Lucas graduated from high school as valedictorian, delivering a powerful speech that left the entire town of Silverbrook in stunned silence. He spoke not just about his academic journey, but about the importance of kindness, of rising above prejudice, and of the strength that comes from perseverance. As he stood at the podium, looking out at the faces of the people who had once dismissed him and his mother, he felt a sense of closure. He didn't need their approval anymore. He had transcended their judgments. But still, there was something in the way they watched him now, something different. Respect, perhaps, or maybe just the realization that they had been wrong. The summer flew by quickly. Lucas and Abigail spent as much time together as they could, knowing that soon he would be off to a new chapter of his life. They took long walks through the town, reminiscing about the challenges they had faced together. They laughed about the times they had to make do with so little, and Lucas marveled at how strong Abigail had been through it all. She was his hero, the reason he had made it this far. One evening, a week before Lucas was set to leave for Johns Hopkins, they sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was streaked with oranges and pinks, a reminder that even endings could be beautiful. "I can't believe this is really happening," Lucas said softly, staring at the sky. "Everything is about to change." "Life is always changing," Abigail replied, her voice steady. "But that doesn't mean we lose the things that matter most. No matter where you go, no matter how far, you'll always have a home here with me." Lucas smiled, feeling a lump form in his throat. He had always known that, but hearing it now meant everything. As the day of his departure approached, Lucas found himself thinking about the people who had shaped his journey, both those who had supported him and those who had tried to tear him down. He thought about Pastor Johnson, who had once looked at him with thinly veiled disapproval. He thought about Mrs. Thompson, who had whispered cruel things about him and Abigail in the grocery store. He thought about Tommy, the boy who had pushed him down in elementary school and told him he didn't belong. And then he thought about his father, Andrew, who had reached out and tried to make amends. They had met a few more times over the summer, and while their relationship was still fragile, it was beginning to grow. Lucas wasn't sure what the future held for them, but he knew that he didn't carry the anger he once had. Forgiving his father hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary for both of them. Andrew had offered to help with Lucas's college expenses, and while Lucas was hesitant at first, Abigail had gently encouraged him to accept the help. "He's trying, Lucas. That means something." The day of departure finally arrived. Lucas and Abigail loaded the car with everything he would need for his new life in Baltimore. The drive was long, and the silence between them was comfortable, though each of them knew that the moment they reached the university, everything would change. Abigail had insisted on coming with him, wanting to help him settle into his dorm room and see the place that would be his home for the next several years. When they arrived at Johns Hopkins, Lucas couldn't help but feel a surge of excitement and nerves. The campus was sprawling and beautiful, filled with students from all over the world. He felt small in comparison to the grandeur of it all, but also exhilarated. This was his future, a future he had fought so hard to achieve. As they unpacked his things in the small dorm room, Abigail gave him a smile that was equal parts joy and sorrow. "This is it," she said softly, her voice catching slightly. "You're really doing it." Lucas nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Mom." They embraced one last time, a hug filled with all the love, sacrifice, and shared struggles that had defined their lives together. And then, with tears in her eyes but a smile on her face, Abigail left, leaving Lucas to take his first steps into this new world on his own. The days and weeks that followed were a blur of orientation events, classes, and adjusting to life away from Silverbrook. Lucas threw himself into his studies, determined to excel in the competitive environment of Johns Hopkins. It was challenging, more challenging than anything he had faced before, but he thrived under the pressure. His passion for medicine deepened with every lecture, every lab experiment, every discussion with his professors. Despite the newness of his surroundings, there were moments when Lucas felt the familiar pang of loneliness. He missed Abigail, missed the comfort of their small home, and the quiet rhythm of their life together. But he knew that this was part of growing up, part of becoming the person he was meant to be. One day, as Lucas sat in a study room preparing for an upcoming exam, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Abigail. "I'm so proud of you. Keep shining, my brilliant boy." Lucas smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. He had come so far from the boy who had been told he didn't belong, to the young man on the path to achieving his dream. And through it all, the love and support of his mother had been his guiding light. A few weeks into the semester, Lucas received an unexpected email from a faculty member. Dr. Patel, one of the top cardiologists at the university hospital, had heard about Lucas's academic achievements and was interested in offering him a spot in a competitive research program. It was an opportunity that could set him apart from other pre-med students, giving him hands-on experience in the field of medicine he had always dreamed of. Lucas stared at the email, his heart racing. This was everything he had worked for, and as he sat there, contemplating this incredible opportunity, he realized something. All the struggles he had faced, the prejudice, the isolation, the rejection, had only made him stronger. They had forged him into the person he was today. He picked up his phone and called Abigail. When she answered, he could hear the joy in her voice, even before he spoke. "Mom," he said, his voice filled with excitement. "I just got offered a spot in a research program with one of the top cardiologists here. This could be huge." Abigail's laughter rang through the phone, filled with pride and love. "Oh, Lucas, I knew it. I knew you were destined for greatness." And in that moment, Lucas knew she was right. His journey was far from over, but he was no longer the boy who had been pushed down by life's challenges. He was rising above them, reaching for the future he had always dreamed of, one filled with purpose, love, and the promise of making a difference in the world.